Hey guys, Paul Warburg back in Utah today. Today's video is going to be a little bit different from my usuals. Because I've been sick for the past week or so, I have been spending a lot of my time, more so than usual, reading. And that gave me an idea where I thought, hey, I should share with my YouTube audience some of the books that I have enjoyed the most and found the most influential over the past year or so. You know, I get a lot of comments on every one of my YouTube videos asking me, Paul, how do you get all of your information? Like, how do you know so much about all of these topics that you talk about? And the answer is actually kind of boring. I do this crazy thing called reading, where I go to bookstores, physical or virtual. I pick up books off the shelf. I open them up. I read the words on the pages. And as I read those words, I absorb them and they inform my worldview. And the more books that I read, the more connections I can make, which help inform the videos that you guys know, love, and enjoy. So I wanted to share with you some of the top books that I have found the most influential in case you would be interested in diving deeper on some of the topics that I talk about here on a regular basis. Now, just one quick caveat as I get into this. Just because I recommend a book does not mean that I agree with 100% of the things that are said in that book. I find that there is rarely, if ever, a book that is written by a human author where I don't disagree with at least one or several things. But lo and behold, that turns out to be okay. I love it when people challenge my thinking because either that converts me to a better position or it shores up my own beliefs about my pre-existing position so that I can hold it even more strongly than I did before. So with that caveat out of the way, I want to dive into the books. And the first book that I want to recommend that's been very influential for me this year is a popular book. A lot of you have heard of it. It is called War by Bob Woodward. Now, the reason that I have really enjoyed this book is because it provides a pretty comprehensive explanation of the internal conversations that have gone inside of the White House over the past several years, encompassing the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. It is super fascinating because what you find when you read snippets and transcripts and reports of actual conversations is that often the things that are happening are so much different than the way that they are described, for example, on talk radio or on talk TV. You can see in this book a lot of the strategy that went into the decisions the White House made. Whether or not you agree with them, that strategy is really fascinating to read, to see how presidents think and actually the magnitude of the pressures that they face when making major decisions that relate to things like war. Another thing I appreciated about this book is even though it has a pretty clear political slant towards one political party, I still found it to be pretty balanced. This book had good things and bad things to say about both Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and I appreciate a book that can provide a balanced perspective on all sides, even if it takes a particular side, because it shows me that they are actually critically thinking through the issues and not just filtering everything through their rhetoric. Some of the most interesting conversations in this book were conversations with cabinet members who expressed a lot of concerns about both presidents. And I think if you find it, you'll have a much better understanding of why the things in our world are happening right now. Now, another book that I found really fascinating this year has been this book called The New Map by Daniel Yergin. This is a book I know a lot of people who watch my channel are familiar with. And the reason I like this book, I mean, first and foremost, the topic is interesting, but Daniel Yergin is just an excellent author. A lot of you say you enjoy how I break things down into simple terms so that anybody can understand. And Daniel Yergin, I mean, he runs circles around me in his ability to communicate complex things succinctly and clearly. Now, the new map, what this book does is it talks about how the world map is changing based on the ebbs and flows of new trends and energy related to oil and natural gas and things like that. At first, to some of you, that might sound really boring, but it's actually super fascinating if you just start reading it. And this book, why I find it really interesting is that it's a little older in the sense that it just predates Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it predates the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, but it talks about both of those things. And it's really interesting to read a book just before Russia invaded Ukraine, talking pretty bluntly about Russia's energy goals and how that might lead to a conflict. Because you can see all of the pieces as they're lining up before the war began and before things got wrapped up in political rhetoric on either side. So this is super fascinating. In particular, the stuff about Russia and Ukraine, but also China. And you will learn so much about the way the world works if you understand how geography works in relation to energy. So I highly recommend this book. Now, another book that I really recommend you read this year is Why Nations Fail: The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty. This is one of those books that I read that challenged some of my worldview in a lot of ways and shored up my worldview in a lot of other ways. And the basic thesis of this book is that nations tend to fail throughout history due to systemic problems with wealth inequality. And it has a lot of data to back that up. It talks, for example, a lot about the reason that democracy arose in the United States and was so sticky in the United States as opposed to South America. Because of the different natures of those regions, colonialism affected those regions differently and resulted in different outcomes. And I found particularly fascinating in this book the history of South America, which I realized was a major gap in my historical understanding, because it's something that we just didn't talk a lot about in American school. This book covered so many details that I had never considered, in particular, why there were so many revolutions in South America that created the nations that we have today. So this is a really important book right now, especially if you are somebody who has ever thought about the issues of wealth inequality and has grappled with those and has wondered where that leads in the long term. Well, there's a lot of historical examples, and this book gives them. Now, for my next recommendation, I'm actually going to cheat, and I'm going to recommend two books, Prisoners of Geography and The Power of Geography by Tim Marshall. And the reason that I recommend these books together is because actually, if you read both these books, you'll realize that they're really basically two volumes of the same book. Prisoners of Geography is a super popular, super approachable book that talks about why the nations of the world sit where they do today. It has a lot to do with oceans and mountains and deserts, but it's like way more interesting than you would ever imagine when you actually read and grapple with that information. These books will help you better understand some of the world's largest conflicts. They will help you understand World War II and why that played out over the territory that it did. And they will also help you understand, even though they don't touch on it explicitly, Russia's war against Ukraine and why it's so critical, and also what China is doing in and around the South China Sea and why that's so critical and why that's so scary. A topic that's also covered in The New Map, the other book that I recommended earlier. My final recommendation is another one from Tim Marshall, which is The Future of Geography, which is not for the faint of heart. This book talks a lot about space and satellite warfare, which when you read it, you realize is quite a bit more chilling than most people give it credit for. There's been a lot of jokes and humdrums about the Space Force being established in the United States. But when you read this book, you'll realize pretty clearly why that's a thing and why we need it. This book really addresses a knowledge gap that I think the world as a whole hasn't grappled with enough yet. And that's represented in the fact that this is actually by far the least popular of all the books that I'm going to recommend, but it might be one of the most important. So I figure 5 or actually 6 books is plenty to get you started. And if you actually do read those books, you will have a better understanding of geopolitics than probably 99% of the world's population, which is going to take you a long ways. If you guys are interested in picking up any of those books, by the way, there will be affiliate links in the description of this video. I'm not trying to make a ton of money on that. I think I get 4.5% off the cover price if you purchase using my link. So of course, feel free to purchase from anywhere you want. I look forward to interacting with you guys as I make videos touching on a lot of the topics covered in these books, and I'll see you on those videos.